At 7:32 on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch looked up to see 6 Japanese Zero fighters diving toward his 4F Wildcats near Wake Island. He had about 90 seconds before someone died. Thatch was 37 years old, with over 200 hours flying the Wildcat. He had never shot down a Zero. The numbers were unforgiving. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could climb faster, turn tighter, and outmaneuver the Wildcat at virtually every altitude. Japanese pilots knew it. American pilots knew it. The physics were merciless. A Zero could complete a full turning circle roughly 14 seconds faster than a Wildcat. 14 seconds. 14 seconds to slip onto your tail. 14 seconds to line up 20mm cannons. 14 seconds to kill you. By February 1942, American forces in the Pacific had lost 43 Wildcats in one-on-one turning fights against Zeros. 43 pilots who tried to match the Japanese in maneuverability. 43 funerals. The pattern was always the same. American pilot spots Zero. American pilot turns to engage. Zero outturns him. Zero shoots him down. Command kept repeating the same guidance. Avoid turning engagements. Extend away. Disengage if possible. But disengaging meant abandoning wingmen. It meant watching friends get strafed while you ran. Thatch commanded Fighting Squadron 3, 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 lives under his responsibility. He had no mechanical advantage, no speed advantage, no turn advantage, only discipline and an idea. 3 nights earlier, in his quarters in San Diego, Thatch had stared at a small box of wooden matches sent by his wife. He had been thinking about the Zero problem for weeks. How do you defeat an opponent who can outturn you every time? He placed 2 matches side by side. Then he slid them past each other in opposite directions. They crossed, turned, crossed again, each covering the other. They never separated. They never left the other exposed. And something clicked. What if 2 Wildcats fought as one? Instead of splitting apart and engaging independently, what if they stayed paired, weaving back and forth? If a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's tail, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him, they would cross paths. The Zero chasing one would fly directly into the guns of the other. It contradicted standard doctrine. Since World War I, fighter pilots were trained to separate in combat. Pairs stayed together only for navigation. Once the fight began, you fought alone. But Thatch couldn't ignore what the matches showed him. 43 dead pilots proved the existing doctrine was failing. If something didn't change, the numbers would keep climbing. He called in his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare. Thatch laid the matches on the desk and demonstrated the crossing pattern. O'Hare watched silently, then asked one question. When do we try it? 4 days later, Thatch was about to find out whether his matchstick concept would save lives or get 4 men killed. The 6 Zeros were now less than 1,200 yards away, descending fast from 11,000 feet. Standard Japanese approach: gain altitude advantage, dive with speed, isolate targets. Thatch's formation consisted of 4 Wildcats in a loose line abreast. Lieutenant, junior grade, Edward Bassett, flew about 800 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, flown by ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Coulson, trailed farther out. Conventional doctrine demanded immediate split and independent engagement. Instead, Thatch keyed his radio. Bassett, on me. Weave pattern. Execute. The order had never been spoken in U.S. Navy combat before. Bassett banked toward Thatch. Thatch turned toward Bassett. The two Wildcats flew directly at one another. To the Japanese pilots above, it must have looked like panic or a collision about to happen. At 400 yards separation, both Wildcats banked hard. Thatch pulled left. Bassett pulled right. They crossed with barely 200 feet between wingtips. Then they kept turning, arcing around to cross again. A figure 8 pattern in the sky. Two aircraft interlocking like gears. The lead Zero selected Bassett as its target. Classic tactic. Close in. Exploit superior turn radius. Fire from behind. The Zero committed. 600 yards. 500. 400. The Japanese pilot expected Bassett to try to turn away. Instead, Bassett turned toward Thatch. The Zero followed, tightening the arc, 3 seconds from firing position. Then Thatch came through the crossing point. Guns already aligned. He fired at 300 yards. 50 caliber rounds tore through the Zero's engine. The Japanese pilot had only one option: break off or fly into a wall of bullets. He broke, pulled hard right, and climbed away, trailing smoke. The other Zeros hesitated. For the first time, Wildcats were not running. They were forcing the Zeros to disengage. Sheedy and Coulson saw the weave succeed. They turned toward each other, executed the same crossing pattern. Another Zero committed to Coulson's tail, closed to 400 yards. Then Sheedy crossed and opened fire. The Zero flinched, pulled vertical, disengaged. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. 6 Zeros versus 4 Wildcats. Standard expectation: 4 American losses. Actual outcome: 0 American losses. When the Zeros climbed away and withdrew, all 4 Wildcats were still flying. Thatch checked fuel, checked wingmen. No one hit. The weave had worked. He landed 40 minutes later at Ford Island. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from realization. The Zero's advantage could be neutralized. But command was cautious. Thatch submitted a detailed combat report describing the weave, the geometry, and its effect. 3 days later, the response arrived. Interesting concept. Requires further evaluation before fleet-wide adoption. Meanwhile, Japanese plans were already unfolding. In 68 days, Thatch would face not 6 Zeros, but 50, over an island called Midway. And he would have 8 Wildcats. Between February and June 1942, Thatch drilled his squadron relentlessly. Morning sorties, afternoon practice, night formation training when the moon allowed. Turn toward your wingman. Cross. Turn back. Cross again. At 300 miles per hour, with enemy fighters trying to kill you. Some pilots mastered it quickly, others struggled. But Thatch kept repeating the lesson, because the alternative was funerals. By May 1942, the Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats in combat against Zeros. 91. Every week brought new names. Every week brought more telegrams sent to families. Official instructions still emphasized avoidance. Disengage when possible, use altitude, preserve aircraft. But in real combat, pilots rarely had the luxury of clean escape. If you ran, your wingman might not. If you extended away, the Zero might simply switch targets. Thatch understood something fundamental. Doctrine must serve survival, not tradition. Then came intelligence that changed everything. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications. The Japanese were planning a massive operation against Midway Island. 4 fleet carriers. Hundreds of aircraft. It would be the largest coordinated carrier strike Japan had ever launched. Admiral Chester Nimitz called in every available carrier. Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese. The balance of the Pacific War would hinge on what happened next. Fighting Squadron 3 received orders on May 26th. Report to USS Yorktown. Prepare for carrier operations. Thatch gathered his 7 pilots, 7 Wildcats, 7 men who had practiced the weave for months, though the Navy had not officially endorsed it. He laid the matches out again, explained it one more time. Then, he told them the truth. The Japanese may bring 50 Zeros. We may have 8 Wildcats in the air. The only way we survive is together. One pilot asked quietly, "And if it fails?" Thatch had no comforting answer. He simply repeated what he believed. If we don't try something different, we die. Yorktown sailed on May 30th, 4 days to Midway, 4 days before Japanese carrier aircraft would descend in numbers never before faced. On June 4th, 1942, at 9:30 hours, Thatch climbed to 14,000 feet above Yorktown. The first Japanese strike wave approached, 18 dive bombers, escorted by 12 Zeros. Not 50, but 12 was still a 3-to-1 advantage over Thatch's 4-plane section. The Zeros held altitude, 15,000 feet. They began their dive. Thatch counted quickly. 4 Wildcats, 12 Zeros. He keyed his radio. Weave pattern. Execute on my mark. Bassett held position to his right. 2 more Wildcats trailed slightly behind. The Zeros dove aggressively. 3 targeted Thatch. 4 targeted Bassett. The remaining 5 aimed for Yorktown. Thatch waited until the last possible second. Mark. He and Bassett turned toward each other. The Zeros committed. But instead of isolating targets, they flew into crossing guns. Thatch fired. The first Zero burst into smoke and fell away. For a moment, the impossible had happened again. But the Japanese adapted mid-fight. 2 Zeros split high and low. They attacked from multiple angles, trying to fracture the weave, trying to force independent engagement. For 6 seconds, the formation broke. Thatch felt cannon rounds strike his left wing root. 1 shell passed inches from his canopy. Bassett reported coolant leak damage. The weave had bent, but not broken. Thatch dove to cover Bassett. The Zero pursuing Bassett suddenly found itself facing Thatch's guns. It exploded. Bassett limped toward Yorktown. Thatch found himself alone. 3 Zeros turning toward him. No wingman. No crossing pattern. Just 1 Wildcat against 3 of the most maneuverable fighters in the sky. The weave required 2 aircraft. But Thatch realized something else. It required 2 reference points. He began executing sharp reversals, right turn, immediate left reversal, never committing long enough for a Zero to predict. The Japanese pilot chasing him overshot slightly, then overcorrected. Every correction cost energy. After 40 seconds of violent reversals, the Zero lost its altitude advantage. Thatch had forced parity. The Zero broke off. The other 2 followed. He had survived. Not because the Wildcat outperformed the Zero, but because the Zero pilot could no longer predict the pattern. And unpredictability in combat is power. Thatch landed on Yorktown, with holes in his wing and adrenaline still pounding through his veins. Bassett's Wildcat had taken multiple hits, but made it back. None of his 4 aircraft were lost. 12 Zeros had attacked, 2 had fallen. The rest withdrew. Word spread through the ready room quickly. The weave worked, even against coordinated Japanese tactics. Pilots from Enterprise and Hornet began asking Thatch to explain the maneuver. He showed them again with matches. 2 points crossing. Mutual support. Turn into your wingman. Force the attacker to choose. That afternoon, more Wildcats launched to intercept Japanese strike groups. More pilots attempted the weave. Some executed it perfectly. Others struggled under fire. But something had shifted. Japanese pilots who had once confidently committed to tail chases now hesitated when Wildcats turned toward each other. Hesitation in air combat can be fatal. By June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 was escorting convoys near Midway. 4 pairs of Wildcats flying in coordinated weave formation. 14 Zeros attacked. Thatch called it immediately. Weave. Pairs crossed. Zeros tried traditional tactics. Commit to one tail. The defending Wildcat turned toward its partner. Crossing fire. 1 Zero down. Another damaged. The Japanese broke off. 3 confirmed Zero kills. 0 Wildcat losses. For the first time in sustained combat, Wildcats achieved a favorable exchange ratio against Zeros. Command finally paid attention. On June 15th, Thatch received orders to brief Admiral Nimitz personally at Pearl Harbor. He prepared diagrams. He collected after-action reports. He compiled survival statistics. The numbers were undeniable. In June, before the weave became common practice, American fighters were losing at nearly a 2-to-1 disadvantage. After units began employing the crossing pattern consistently, the ratio improved dramatically. The weave did not make the Wildcat faster. It did not improve its climb rate. It did not magically shrink its turn radius. It altered geometry, and geometry is combat. When Nimitz listened to Thatch explain the matchstick concept, he understood immediately. 2 aircraft protecting each other multiplied their defensive strength. A lone fighter was vulnerable. A coordinated pair was lethal. But while the Navy was reviewing reports, Japanese pilots were analyzing the same engagements. They noticed the crossing pattern. They observed Wildcats refusing to break formation. They developed a counter. Instead of attacking from one direction, they would attack from 3, simultaneously. Over Santa Cruz Island on June 23, 1942, Thatch faced that counter for the first time. 18 Zeros, 8 Wildcats. The Japanese divided into 3 elements: high, left, right. The objective? Overwhelm the weave from multiple angles at once. The Zeros dove in coordinated waves. 6 from above, 6 from the left, 6 from the right. For a moment, confusion spread. Pilots hesitated. Which threat to counter first? Thatch's voice cut through the chaos. Reform pairs. Ignore secondary threats. Execute. The first wave dove. Bassett and his wingman crossed. 1 Zero committed. Flew straight into crossing fire. Exploded. The second wave attacked from the flank. Another pair crossed. Another Zero fell. The weave held. The Japanese had adapted. But adaptation required prediction. And Thatch's pilots had practiced until they could execute the pattern instinctively. After 8 brutal minutes, 5 Zeros had been shot down. No Wildcats lost. The 3-angle attack had failed. The Japanese withdrew. Thatch realized something critical. The weave was not just a tactic. It was scalable. It worked under pressure. It worked against adaptation. It worked when outnumbered. That evening, Thatch filed another report. No more requests for testing. No more recommendations. A demand. Immediate, fleet-wide adoption. And this time, Command agreed. On June 29, 1942, Admiral Ernest King issued Fleet Order 41-42. All fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet were to adopt the Thatch weave immediately. Mandatory training, mandatory execution, no exceptions. A tactic born from 2 wooden matches was now official U.S. Navy doctrine. But doctrine spread slower than combat. Orders had to reach squadrons scattered across the Pacific. Pilots had to train. timing had to be practiced. And the Japanese were not waiting. On July 7, 1942, over Guadalcanal, 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons flew combat air patrol above Henderson Field. Only 4 of those pilots had been trained in the weave. 8 had not. At 11:20 a.m., 32 Zeros appeared from the north. The pilots who knew the weave instinctively paired off, turned toward each other, crossed. The 8 who did not understand it split up and engaged independently. The outcome was brutal. 22 minutes later, 6 Wildcats were gone. All 6 had fought alone. The 4 pilots executing the weave survived without damage. They claimed 7-0 kills between them. The lesson was undeniable. Coordination meant survival. Isolation meant death. Admiral Halsey reacted immediately. All fighter units in the South Pacific were ordered to master the weave within 2 weeks. Thach was sent to Guadalcanal personally. For 3 weeks, he did nothing but teach. Morning classroom briefings, afternoon formation drills, evening debriefs. He used the matches every time. He explained the geometry. Turn toward your wingman. Make the attacker choose. Force him into guns. Some pilots picked it up in 2 days. Others needed a week. But every pilot learned. By August 1st, 96 Wildcats could execute the weave cleanly. By September 1st, over 200. The tactic began spreading beyond Navy Wildcats. Army Air Forces units flying P-38 Lightnings adapted it. Marine Corps pilots used it. Even bomber formations incorporated crossing defensive patterns based on the same principle. The results were measurable. Before widespread weave adoption, American fighters were losing at ratios as bad as 0.4 to 1. For every 10 American aircraft lost, only 4 Zeros were destroyed. By October 1942, the ratio had shifted to 2 to 1 in favor of American pilots. The Zero was still more maneuverable, still lighter, still deadly. But maneuverability meant nothing if you could not close safely. The weave denied that closure. Japanese pilots hated it. Intercepted communications in September warned, American fighters are using coordinated crossing tactics. Avoid committing to tail pursuit. But avoidance came at a cost. If Japanese pilots disengaged, they surrendered the sky. If they committed, they risked flying directly into crossfire. The Zero's dominance eroded. Confidence faltered. Momentum shifted. And the shift began with a simple question. How do 2 fighters survive against one that can outturn them? The answer was not speed, not power, not technology. It was geometry. By January 1943, the Thach weave was no longer experimental. It was embedded into every fighter pilot's muscle memory. Training manuals were rewritten. Tactical diagrams were updated. New aviators were introduced to it before they ever saw combat. And the numbers kept improving. In the 6 months before widespread adoption, the Pacific Fleet had lost 137 Wildcats in dogfights against Zeros. In the 6 months after, losses dropped to 41. 96 pilots who might have died were still alive. 96 letters that did not need to be written. The weave did not make the Wildcat superior in performance. It made it harder to kill. That distinction mattered, because war is not always about overwhelming the enemy. Sometimes it is about denying him the kill he expects. The Zero's strength was turning ability. Japanese pilots relied on forcing American fighters into one-on-one turning contests. The weave refused that contest. It forced the fight into a cooperative geometry the Zero was never designed to handle. Instead of outturning one aircraft, a Zero suddenly faced 2 intersecting fields of fire. Instead of dictating the fight, it had to react. Reaction costs energy. Energy costs position. Position costs survival. By early 1943, the weave was spreading beyond the Pacific. Royal Navy pilots flying Sea Hurricanes began practicing it. Marine Corps squadrons integrated it into carrier training cycles. Even bomber escort formations adopted crossing defensive tactics inspired by Thach's concept. The principle held across aircraft types. Two fighters supporting each other are exponentially stronger than two fighting alone. John Thach received the Navy Cross in February 1943. The citation referenced development of innovative tactics, which significantly increased survivability of U.S. naval aviators. But medals were not his focus. He tracked something else: numbers. In the months before the weave, casualty reports were predictable. After it, they changed. Pilots were coming home. Thach was reassigned in March 1943 to training duty. Command decided he was more valuable teaching than flying combat. He disliked leaving the front, but he understood the logic. Every pilot he trained multiplied the tactic's reach. He spent 18 months instructing over 800 naval aviators. Every one of them left training knowing the crossing pattern. Everyone carried it into combat, and many would later say it saved their lives. The weave became so ingrained in fighter doctrine that by the time of the Korean War, it was standard practice. In Vietnam, F-4 Phantom pilots adapted it into what became known as the Fluid 4 formation. Different speeds, different aircraft, same principle. Turn toward your wingman. Protect each other. Force the attacker to commit into crossfire. The aircraft changed. The speed doubled. The physics remained. Geometry does not age. John Thach remained in the Navy long after the guns fell silent. He rose through the ranks steadily, commander, captain, and eventually rear admiral. During the Korean War, he commanded carrier air groups, but did not seek personal combat glory. His role had shifted from fighter pilot to mentor and architect of tactical doctrine. He rarely spoke about Midway in dramatic terms. He spoke about preparation, about discipline, about refusing to accept that inferior performance meant inevitable defeat. The Thach weave became one of the few air combat tactics named after a living officer, not because it was flashy, but because it worked. By conservative estimates, over 2,000 American pilots survived World War II because they understood how to execute it. 2,000 lives influenced by a simple insight. In the 1960s, when U.S. pilots in Vietnam encountered MiG-7s and MiG-20s, aircraft that could outturn American jets at certain speeds, instructors revisited the weave concept. Supersonic fighters moved faster than Wildcats ever had, but speed did not eliminate geometry. F-4. Phantom crews adapted the principle. Crossing turns. Mutual support. Never allowing isolation. The lesson held across decades. Thach retired from the Navy in 1973 after 40 years of service. He returned to San Diego, lived quietly. Did not publish memoirs boasting of innovation. When asked about the weave, he often downplayed it. It wasn't brilliance, he would say. It was necessity. Every February 10th, the anniversary of that first combat test, naval aviators called him. Pilots from World War II, from Korea, from Vietnam, men who had survived because someone had taught them to cross paths instead of split apart. In 1981, the Navy named Thach Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola in his honor. Every naval aviator earning wings walked past his portrait. Beneath it were 3 words: innovate, adapt, survive. John Thatch died on April 15, 2001, at the age of 86. At his funeral in Arlington National Cemetery, hundreds of aviators attended. Men who had flown Wildcats, Phantoms, Hornets, different wars. Same tactic. Many later said the same thing. We're here because he was there first. The pack of wooden matches he used to demonstrate the weave is preserved at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Inside a glass case, two simple sticks crossing in a pattern that altered aerial combat history. School groups pass by without much notice. Fighter pilots stop. They understand. Innovation in war does not always begin with engineers or advanced machinery. Sometimes it begins with a commander staring at a problem and refusing to accept the answer given to him. Sometimes it begins with two wooden matches crossing on a desk, and a decision to change the rules before the rules get you killed. When historians analyze air combat in the Pacific War, they often focus on aircraft performance charts, turn radius, climb rate, maximum speed, armament. On paper, the Mitsubishi A6M0 dominated early in the war. It turned faster than the F-4F Wildcat, climbed better, carried powerful 20mm cannons. The Wildcat was heavier, slower, and less maneuverable. By technical comparison alone, the outcome seemed predetermined. But war is not decided only by performance charts. It is decided by adaptation. The Thatch weave did not change the Wildcat's engine. It did not reduce its weight. It did not improve its turn radius. It changed the structure of the fight. Instead of allowing a Zero to isolate and outturn a single Wildcat, the weave forced every engagement into a coordinated geometry. One Wildcat alone was vulnerable. Two working together were exponentially stronger. The Zero's advantage was individual maneuverability. The weave transformed combat from individual to cooperative. That transformation altered casualty rates across an entire theater. By late 1942, American fighter losses dropped dramatically. Japanese pilots reported frustration with American crossing tactics. The Zero remained lethal, but no longer unstoppable. The broader Pacific War would be won by industry, logistics, and strategy. But in the air, survival often hinged on seconds. 14 seconds to get on your tail, 14 seconds to fire, 14 seconds to die. The weave shortened those seconds. It forced hesitation. It forced disengagement. It bought time, and time saves lives. Over 2,000 American aviators survived the war in part because they had been trained to turn toward their wingman instead of away. That is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is geometry. John Thatch never claimed genius. He saw a flaw. He sought a solution. He refused to accept that better turning aircraft meant inevitable defeat. And when confronted with 6 Zeros diving toward 4 Wildcats on a February morning in 1942, he chose to test an idea no manual endorsed. It worked. From Wake Island to Midway, from Guadalcanal to Korea, from Vietnam to modern fighter doctrine, the principle endures. Turn toward your wingman. Cross. Protect each other. Innovate when survival demands it. And never accept that the enemy's advantage is final. Because sometimes the difference between 43 funerals and survival is 2 matches crossing on a desk.